June 21, 1944, New Guinea jungle. German intelligence at the time still described American fighters as too heavy, too inefficient, and dependent on escorts. One Luftwaffe theorist even wrote that the P-38 flew far, but died close. That sentence would age badly, because on that sultry morning a man walked alone through the mud of Hollandia carrying a small notebook and a name that had already fallen from grace: Charles Lindbergh, banished from the U.S. Army, considered a traitor by President Roosevelt, ignored by the Washington bureaucracy. He wore no uniform or possessed military authority, but he carried specific knowledge, and a dangerous one. He knew how to fly further, he knew how to spend less, and he knew that if they listened to him, American fighters could reach where it was previously impossible. This is the story of the civilian who taught the most powerful air force in the world to do what its own manuals said was forbidden. An impossible trick that would extend the range of the P-38s by more than 60%, without changing a single bolt, and turn what was a technical limit into a tactical advantage. What engineers considered risk, he turned it into a routine. The name of it? Knowledge in the right hands. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story. In May 1944, America's P-38 Lightning fighters operated at a maximum range of 570 miles. By July of the same year, 950-mile missions were already considered standard, a jump of 380 miles, more than 60%, achieved not by a new model, nor by secret auxiliary tanks, but by an almost invisible change, the way the engine operates, an adjustment of revolutions per minute, a choice on the mix lever, a decision that, according to the manuals, could kill the engine in mid-flight. And even so, it worked. How is it possible that American pilots doubled the range without changing a single part on the plane? And why did this technique come precisely from a man who shouldn't be there? If you value this type of story, where intelligence turns the impossible into routine, consider supporting the channel. It helps us continue to reveal the forgotten details that once changed the course of a war. At the beginning of 1944, the Pacific was still, for many Allied strategists, a maze of logistical impossibilities. The oceanic vastness, uninhabitable archipelagos, and the absence of landing strips on intermediate islands made the simple task of going back and forth an engineering challenge, not just a combat one. Each extra mile required a brutal calculation: armament weight versus fuel, ideal altitude versus consumption, maximum range versus return alive. It was a scenario where distances spoke louder than radars, and geography defined who lived or died. For single-engine fighters, the crossing was unthinkable. For the P-38 Lightning, the American twin-engine fighter with the longest range at the time, the promise of going further was real, but limited. Even with extra tanks, the J model, in use at that stage of the war, hardly exceeded 570 miles of effective radius, without compromising its combat capability. The pilots flew under the constant shadow of fuel exhaustion. All it took was an unforeseen storm or a protracted air fight to condemn an entire squadron to the open sea. Still, in Berlin, German strategists remained convinced that the Pacific theater was beyond the sustainable capabilities of the Americans. The Japanese Admiralty, its direct allies, fed this illusion by reporting constant failures of air cover in the most remote regions. The strategic mistake would come from the contempt for numbers. While reports from the Third Reich celebrated the accuracy of the Messerschmitts and the audacity of the kamikaze pilots, they ignored what was really going on in the hangars and factories on the other side of the planet. By 1943, the United States was already producing about 96,000 aircraft a year. Germany, even at the height of its industrial mobilization, did not exceed 25,000. And it wasn't just quantity. It was the kind of war that each of these nations had decided to fight. The Luftwaffe operated with tactical focus and concentrated efficiency. The U.S. Army Air Force, on the other hand, operated with range, refueling, and persistence. In simple words, while the Germans calibrated each machine for maximum performance in minimum time, the Americans designed each system thinking about how to keep it running, day after day, mission after mission. This philosophical difference was brutally reflected in the Pacific. Japan, already suffocated by blockades and constrained by its island industrial base, relied on short-range operations and desperate maneuvers. The Americans, by contrast, built artificial islands, mobile runways, aerial refueling tanks, and above all, depended on fighters capable of flying, fighting, and returning, even if it meant scraping every drop of fuel from the tank. In a March 1944 estimate, Allied forces calculated that more than 60% of fighter losses in the Pacific were not due to enemy fire, but from fuel depletion. This statistic, ignored by German intelligence, reveals the real enemy on that front: distance. And it is precisely at this point that the story changes, when air superiority no longer depended on the engine, but on the way the engine was used, when the limits were no longer imposed by the fuselage, but by the mindset, and when a civilian, when without rank, without command, without uniform, knocked on the right door. A pause to reflect. In 1944, the USA had 10 times more capacity to produce aeronautical engines than Germany. 10 times. If this statistic surprises you, write in the comments, absolute power, because it is in this type of number that the true outcome of a war is hidden. But there was still a problem. All this capacity still operated below its true limit. The planes could go further, but they didn't. The engines could yield more, but they did not. Pilots could fly better, but no one had taught them how. America had the resources, but there was a lack of someone who knew how to extract them to the last drop. This someone was about to sit in the cockpit of a P-38 for the first time, and what would come next would put American doctrine itself against the wall. He had become a national symbol in 1927 when he crossed the Atlantic alone aboard the Spirit of St. Louis, but less than 15 years later, he was walking as an outcast in his own country. The historical crossing had turned him into a world hero, but it was his political voice, naive for some, arrogant for others, that would condemn him. By advocating isolationism and openly questioning American involvement in the European War, he drew the direct fury of President Franklin Roosevelt. When he attributed to German technological superiority a real threat to America, the White House interpreted him as a sympathizer of the enemy. The consequence was brutal: public isolation, loss of influence, and the tacit prohibition of wearing a military uniform again. Still, even crushed by politics, his technical competence remained intact. During the 1930s, as Europe was plunged into all-out war, he performed experimental flights for Pan American Airways, crossing the Pacific and Atlantic with autonomy calculations that no other pilot fully understood. It measured fuel consumption in extreme conditions, tested aerodynamic envelopes, and mapped the relationship between power, mixture, and altitude with an accuracy that eluded career pilots. When war broke out and his political reputation prevented him from fighting, he became a civilian consultant. He worked with United Aircraft, Ford in the production of the B-24s, with Chance Vaught in the Corsair, always solving problems that required intuition and mathematics in equal doses. He was a man rejected by the political machine, but indispensable to the industrial machine. And that's the greatest irony. While German officials extolled the myth of the Aryan engineer and ridiculed the American celebrity pilot, the man they despised was about to dramatically increase the range of U.S. fighters, a feat the Luftwaffe itself could never replicate on its front. What none of them knew is that this civilian, humiliated by speeches and disinvited from military salons, carried the only knowledge that the gigantic American industrial machinery lacked: how to turn numbers into survival. And when he finally approached a P-38 Lightning, 3 days before his first mission, the air war in the Pacific began to change direction, though no one there had yet noticed. The final shock would come when the pilots discovered that the technical impossible was not in the plane, but in the man who dared to fly it. June 26, 1944, Hollandia, New Guinea. Inside a rustic shed covered with palm fronds, the silence of the checkers between two Air Force officers was interrupted by the thin figure of a man standing in the doorway. Charles Lindbergh had arrived. He was not announced. He did not wear a uniform. He did not come with formal orders. He carried only a notebook and a name that, for many in that room, belonged to another era, a name more connected to history books than to mission reports. The group's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, looked up from the board, heard the name, and hesitated. He knew fame. But this was not the place for celebrities. The 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, was among the most lethal formations in the Pacific Theater. Its 3 squadrons, the 401st, 432nd, and 403rd, operated the most advanced models of the P-38 Lightning, with reinforced intercoolers and supplemental fuel tanks. They had already accumulated dozens of aerial victories. Those men were not there to revere trophies of the past. They lived at constant risk, facing colossal distances, unpredictable climates, and the threat of Japanese Zeros. The presence of a civilian, let alone a controversial civilian, caused immediate discomfort. But Lindbergh did not ask for favors. He asked permission to talk about fuel consumption on a cruise flight. The proposal sounded absurd. Those pilots were flying to the limit. The engines were already taken to the extreme. Reduce RPM? Change the mix? Play with the pressure of the collector? That was what the manuals warned of as a dangerous practice. What he suggested was not an improvement. It was, in theory, a recipe for disaster. And yet, MacDonald listened. Maybe out of respect, maybe out of curiosity, perhaps by intuition. He agreed to a single condition. Lindbergh would fly, not as a passenger, as a winger, with weapons, and if he survived, then he would speak. The next morning, his name was already circulating around the camp. Some laughed, others were suspicious. Major Thomas Maguire, then with 15 confirmed victories, wanted to see what the old man would be able to do. MacDonald himself, a veteran of combat in the Pacific, did not know what to expect. But one thing was certain. Lindbergh would have to prove every word in heaven, where no political speech made a difference. Meanwhile, Germany continued to ignore the growing role of technical civilians in the American war structure. A Luftwaffe report, intercepted weeks earlier, stated that Americans trust industry too much, and their officers too little. Historical irony. Because, at that very moment, it was a civilian who was about to teach officers how to get an extra 400 miles off a plane designed to do less than half. The air war was about to enter a new phase, and it would begin with a quiet takeoff in the mud of New Guinea. June 27, 1944. At 10:30 a.m., 4 P-38 fighters took off from Hollandia under the command of Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald. The weather was unstable, the low clouds forced visual navigation, and the mission was simple: attack a Japanese barge in Kaibo's Bay. On board the 3rd Formation position, flying as Blue 3, was a civilian, Charles Lindbergh. The first of his 25 combat missions with the 475th Group had just begun. For experienced drivers, the expectation was tolerance. Maybe he would, maybe it wouldn't get in the way. But as the minutes progressed, the surprise began to emerge. Lindbergh maintained the formation impeccably, lined up on the wing of Ace Thomas Maguire as if he had been born in that cockpit. In tactical flight, this precision is not a detail. It defines life or death. Over the target, the Japanese barge was attacked in a low air. The 4 fighters dived under light anti-aircraft fire, firing their cannons and 50 caliber machine guns. Lindbergh shot like any other driver. No hesitation, no break of rhythm. On the way back, silence on the radio. The mission had been a success. But the real surprise would only come when he touched the ground. At the end of the shutdown procedures, the crew chiefs carried out the standard check of the tanks. Lindbergh's P-38 had returned with a significantly larger fuel reserve than the other 3 aircraft, even though it flew the same course, faced the same weight, and performed the same maneuvers. A coincidence? Coincidence? The technical commander noted the discrepancy, but did not comment. 2 days later, after a new mission, this time a 6.5-hour coastal patrol, the anomaly repeated itself. While the other pilots landed with practically dry tanks, the civilian brought back 210 gallons, and that raised a nagging question. What was he doing differently? The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because what seemed like a fluke began to become standard. Mission after mission, Lindbergh flew like the others, fought like the others, but landed with twice as much fuel left. Not only did he survive his first mission, he exposed a systemic flaw. The pilots were operating their engines the way they were taught, but not in the most efficient way. And that, for an Air Force that operated at the limit of autonomy, was not a technical curiosity. It was a threat to doctrine. On the next flight, one of the officers decided to observe closely, and what he discovered would start a veiled conflict between manuals, instinct, and the truth of the fuel panel. After his 4th combat mission, the difference was no longer ignorable. The 475th's Chief of Maintenance, Sergeant Wilkes, compared the consumption reports and noticed something abnormal. While the standard P-38s consumed between 310 and 340 gallons per tactical cruise flight, Lindbergh's was returning with spending below 240. The data, initially treated as a measurement error, was repeated. After the sixth mission, Colonel MacDonald called Lindbergh for a direct technical conversation. He wanted to know how, without modifying a single part of the Allison V-1710 engine, he was able to fly the same routes with 25% to 30% less consumption. Lindbergh responded with numbers, and without hesitation. He explained that he operated the engines at reduced RPM, between 1600 and 1750 revolutions per minute, while increasing the pressure in the manifold to 30 to 40 inches of mercury. The mixture was kept at the poorest possible point, within the safe detonation range, and the flight was conducted with minimal variations in power, respecting the thermal curve of the engine. The concept was simple: sacrifice revs and increase pressure to extract torque with less wear and more autonomy. The problem? Lockheed's and Allison's technical manuals expressly warned against this type of configuration. They were considered emergency parameters, acceptable only for seconds, not flight hours. For engineers, the method could lead to catastrophic valve failures, overheating, and charring. But there, on the field, the results were different. No breakdown, no harm, just efficiency. And efficiency, in the Pacific, meant survival. MacDonald, skeptical by nature, authorized the mechanics to partially disassemble Lindbergh's engine after the eighth mission. They expected to find signs of wear, premature failures, damage to the cylinders. They found the opposite: perfect compression, temperatures within the range, and less accumulation of residue in the cylinder heads, indications that the heretical operation was, in practice, cleaner than the official doctrine. The colonel then summoned the maintenance officers to a technical meeting. On a makeshift blackboard, Lindbergh drew power curves, explained the thermodynamic logic of pressure versus rotation, and described how to fly with the absolute minimum of throttle oscillation. The mechanics, practical and hardened men, did not argue. They had already seen the numbers. But the pilots hesitated. It went against everything they had been taught. Slowing down rotation in combat was considered technical suicide. One major even asked if he would take responsibility if an engine exploded on a mission. Lindbergh responded with a simple phrase: "If it happens, I'll be there to fall together." The phrase circulated around the camp, and with it, distrust began to give way to curiosity. In the following days, 3 pilots, voluntarily, asked to fly using the suggested settings. The results were identical: fuel savings between 22% and 29%, no loss of performance, no damage recorded. One of them commented in a low voice, "It's as if the plane breathes a sigh of relief." The American doctrine, built on ground tests and safety standardization, was beginning to be questioned by the experience of a man who learned to fly alone over the Atlantic. And the most disturbing thing is that the Germans, with their obsession with manuals and exact engineering, would never have imagined that the Americans would be willing to learn anything from a discredited civilian. In a document captured months later on Leyte, a Luftwaffe officer wrote, "American superiority lies in its production, but his technical doctrine is immature. They depend on the data they receive, not the data they discover." The phrase at that moment was already obsolete, because the data was being discovered and put into practice. And on the next mission, the 475th would put this technical heresy to the test, in real combat. In the stuffy interior of the New Guinea jungle, the transformation of a technical concept into an operational doctrine ran up against something tougher than any metal structure: pride. The undisputed success of the missions carried out with Lindbergh's technique was already spreading through the 475th group as a growing, almost heretical murmur. The data was in the fuel sheets, in the flight logs, in the maintenance reports. Each of the new missions showed between 20% and 30% savings and no engine failures. But the truth, even when evident, is not always welcome. Career officers, trained under the strict discipline of flight schools, saw in the civilians' instructions a veiled risk. One of them, Major Kenneth Glenn, even said, if that was right, it would have come in the manuals. Others, more direct, accused Lindbergh of mechanical irresponsibility. Some more conservative mechanics warned that this could compromise the reliability of the engines in the long term, as if the long term, in combat, was more relevant than the next landing. But what really sustained this resistance was psychological. It was hard to admit that a civilian, let alone a civilian banned for political reasons, knew more about the limits of the P-38 than the Air Force's own fighter instructors. It was not just a technical issue. It was a wound in the military ego. The Air Force had professionalized based on rules, formulas, and hierarchical authority. And now, a man who answered to no general without an insignia on his chest was teaching the best pilots how to fly the other way. In silence, some accepted, but publicly, few had the courage to endorse it. Colonel MacDonald, although convinced by the data, hesitated to make the method official. His superiors in Brisbane would never accept such a drastic change without formal studies. And even more, if something went wrong, the blame would fall on him. In times of war, innovation without a stamp was seen as disobedience. What Lindbergh proposed, lowering the RPM and flying with a poor mix, was seen by many as piloting on a razor's edge, a practice that, although safe in thermodynamic logic, seemed unstable in the eyes of the doctrine. Still, the numbers kept coming. On coastal attack and long-distance patrol missions, pilots testing the technique were coming back with more fuel, greater residual range, and most importantly, no visible wear and tear on the engines. An unofficial statistic, compiled by a technical petty officer, pointed out that if the entire Pacific Fleet adopted Lindbergh's parameters, the logistical gain would allow the line of operations to be moved up to 150 miles without the need for new advanced runways, a feat that would cost months and thousands of lives in the previous logic. But there was more than numbers at stake. There was the silent fear of admitting that the doctrine was wrong, that the manuals didn't cover everything, and that, in the middle of 1944, there was still room for improvisation, not as a risk, but as a method. In Berlin, the High Command still maintained old reports that classified P-38 fighters as inefficient for extended-range warfare. In a Luftwaffe memo dated April, the sentence was clear. The operational radius of American air forces in the Pacific limits their offensive effectiveness. No significant changes were observed. The sentence was already false when it was written, and it was about to be debunked on a much larger scale, because the next step was already being prepared. To use the Lindbergh method not only to save fuel, but to reach where the Japanese did not expect to be reached. On July 3, 1944, after nearly 2 weeks of silent observation, Colonel Charles MacDonald broke his hesitation. He gathered his technical officers in a makeshift shelter by the runway and announced that, from that day on, the flight parameters suggested by Charles Lindbergh would be officially adopted on extended cruise missions. The news caused immediate discomfort. The doctrine break was more than an operational decision. It was a quiet rewriting of the way the Air Force operated at the front. But the context required audacity. The P-38s operated at increasingly extensive distances, with targets in poorly mapped regions and limited escort. The promise of 30% more autonomy wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. In practice, MacDonald's order meant flying at rotations that were considered dangerous with lean mixing and higher than recommended manifold pressure. In the words of one of the lieutenants, it was like flying listening to the engine whisper. On the first mission under the new protocol, 8 aircraft from 431st Squadron cruised 860 miles over the sea to attack supply depots on the north coast of New Britain. 5 of them used Lindbergh's power profile. The other 3, as a control group, flew on traditional parameters. The result was unequivocal. The 5 that followed the new regimen returned with 180 gallons more, on average. Cylinder head temperatures remained within the margin, and the engines showed stable operation throughout the mission. The difference in the behavior of the drivers was visible. Less sudden accelerations, less corrections. Flying became more disciplined and more efficient. On land, the reports piled up, and with them, conviction. In the span of 1 week, the 475th Group carried out 19 missions with mixed profiles. In 17 of them, the drivers who followed Lindbergh's technique returned with higher operating reserves and less wear and tear on the components. Average consumption dropped from 390 to 270 gallons per mission, a gain of 30% that allowed, in practical terms, to move the American offensive line by almost 300 kilometers without changing a single base. This data alone dismantled the Luftwaffe's analysis of the impossibility of American operations in depth in the Pacific. And for those who doubt the strategic difference of this, it is worth a number. In that same month, the production of aeronautical engines in the USA exceeded that of Germany by 11 times. 11 times. A difference so absurd that the Luftwaffe refused to believe the intelligence reports. If this statistic surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins, because victory in the air is not only decided by the throttle, but by the way that lever is turned. In Hollandia, the doctrine began to change, not by decree but by repetition. The pilots commented among themselves. The mechanics adjusted the mixtures. Commanders reviewing briefings. Institutional resistance gave way to combat pragmatism. The technical heresy of a civilian now became an informal recommendation. And little by little, forbidden settings became the new normal. But Lindbergh did not stop there. He knew that more important than flying farther, it was to teach each driver to do the same. And his next step would be riskier, entering the instruction rooms, redesigning the trainings, and with only a chalkboard and a torque curve, confronting the very engineers who wrote the manuals. In August 1944, a civilian's quiet technique began to resonate as unwritten doctrine on airstrips scattered throughout the Pacific. From the 475th Group at Hollandia, Lindbergh's logic crossed over to other P-38-equipped units, the 8th Fighter Group at Finschhafen, the 49th at Biak, and even formations newly arrived in the Philippines. There was no official memorandum, no formal orders, but there were numbers, and in war, numbers speak louder than insignia. Pilots who heard about the method, low RPM, high pressure, calibrated mixture, went on to test it on their own. The result was always the same: more range, less strain on the engine, greater control over flight time. The conversion was gradual, but irreversible. Lindbergh's technical knowledge, once seen as civil heresy, became tactical culture among the squads. In practice, this meant more than fuel economy. It meant freedom of action. Missions that previously required long-range bombers began to be executed with fighters. Escorts that previously had to return halfway now made their way to the target. And the Japanese, who relied on the dead zones of American reach, saw these zones disappear. Bases once considered untouchable began to be attacked by squadrons that, weeks before, would not even have had fuel to arrive. The P-38s began to appear where before there was only silence. And that silence was lethal. No new turbines were installed, no redesigned wings, no mechanical innovations had been applied. The whole transformation happened in the fist that held the throttle, and in the mind that read the tachometer. America, with all its industrial capacity, was taught by one man to make better use of what it already had, and that was perhaps his greatest weapon. In an internal report intercepted months later in Malaya, a Japanese official wrote, "They now appear without warning, even where our fighters do not reach." It was the exact description of the new strategic reach of the Americans. And all of this had come from a notebook and a handful of missions flown by a man deemed unworthy of wearing the uniform. The average range of the P-38s, once limited to 570 miles, now exceeded 950. No extra tanks, no refurbishments, just applied intelligence. And the most symbolic, no decoration was given, no official highlights were published. The idea exploded into silence, but it redrew the range of action of the war. What would come next would prove that while the enemy counted aircraft, the United States counted on autonomy. And on the next mission, that autonomy would change the course of an entire offensive and reveal the real reason Lindbergh had to stop. In September 1944, what began as an informal experiment in the 475th Fighter Group turned into a quiet movement across the Pacific. The technique that promised greater range, previously restricted to test flights and isolated missions, began to be disseminated by pilots, not manuals. They talked to each other at briefings, on approach radios, in nightly conversations in the tents. Lindbergh's method, initially received with suspicion, gained strength because it worked. At the 8th Fighter Group at Morotai, a maintenance lieutenant reported that fighters that flew at reduced RPM were returning with 25 to 35% differences in consumption, savings that, on a campaign scale, represented hundreds of thousands of gallons saved. The data spread like gunpowder, and more than that, it began to be adapted. Pilots of the 49th Group tested the same logic on P-47 Thunderbolts and reported similar gains, adjusting the mixing and torque curve parameters based on observations made with the P-38. It was no longer about Lindbergh. It was about method, technique, about understanding that machines, no matter how standardized, could still be optimized by those who dared to leave the safe margin of manuals. In several units, the informal power structure, respected veterans, squad aces, maintenance chiefs, took on the role of multiplier. Knowledge flowed through reliable voices, not through the communiques of the general staff. The doctrine was no longer written, it was transmitted. A squadron leader of the 482nd recorded that, in just 10 days, 19 of the 24 pilots in his group had adopted the configurations tested by the man of silence, as some now called Lindbergh. In a short time, the workshops themselves began to adjust the engines considering these variables: recalibrated manifold pressure, readjusted mixing valves, more reliable temperature monitors. The doctrine became applied engineering. The culture changed with her. Pilots were no longer just looking for peak performance, they now wanted to reach the enemy where he thought he was unreachable. In one of the records from the Nadzab base, one squadron's mission diary mentions, "The new regime allows us to cover the coastal zone without having to refuel. This alters the offensive posture and disarms the enemy's early defense." The change was subtle but profound. The strategic autonomy of fighters, once an obstacle, now became a tool of surprise. Japanese safety zones have shrunk. Bases that had previously operated without concern now came under unexpected attack from fighters that should not, theoretically, have the fuel to get that far. A Japanese report captured on Leyte describes, "The Americans are carrying out fighter strikes in depth without additional logistical support. Our operational radius predictions are incorrect." It was the formal acknowledgement of a miscalculation, caused by a cultural change, not a new peace. And this was the invisible force of American war, the ability to turn knowledge into a standard before it became doctrine. One pilot teaches another. A sergeant shares a mixing curve. An entire squadron flies 100 miles beyond the projection. And the enemy, relying on outdated statistical models, sees its rear collapse. The Luftwaffe, that same month, still described the P-38s as unsuitable for prolonged pursuits, based on data from 1943. The phrase appeared in a bulletin signed by a technical engineer from the High Command. The data was already dead, but it still guided decisions. If this type of analysis error surprises you, comment here. Outdated data kills. Because on the battlefield, it's not the fastest plane that wins. It is the one that flies where the enemy does not expect it. And that truth was about to become irreversible. On the next mission, the Americans would fly beyond the line marked on the Japanese maps, and what they would find there would be confirmation that the war was now decided long before the first shot. July 12, 1944. The mission was an offensive patrol over the coastal region of Talicia, New Britain. Lindbergh flew as Captain McDonald's wingman in a formation of 4 P-38s. The weather was clear, and the visibility extended to the horizon. Shortly after 10:20 a.m., the formation spotted movement over the waters. A lone Japanese fighter, model Kai-43 Hayabusa, flying close to the surface. The enemy, lighter and more agile, was piloted by Saburo Shimada, a veteran of Imperial Aviation and responsible for at least 7 confirmed kills. The Japanese tactic was clear: attack low, force a break in formation, and isolate the Allied fighters. And at that moment, as he launched himself against the Americans, Shimada probably did not know that one of the P-38s in front of him was operated by a civilian. The attack was swift. Shimada climbed into an aggressive dive and opened fire. The first 2 P-38s scattered. Lindbergh held the line, followed cover protocol, and turned his fighter to the rear of the Japanese turn. Within seconds, he was on the trail of the Hayabusa. McDonald over the radio ordered, "Break and burn." It was the password to engage. In that split second, Charles Lindbergh made a decision that no doctrine could have anticipated. He pulled the trigger. The 50 roared. 3 short bursts. The Japanese fighter wobbled, smoked, and spiraled until it touched the water, where it exploded in a column of flames and foam. Witnessed by 2 other pilots of the 475th, that shoot down was never officially recorded. Lindbergh, as a civilian, could not claim victories. But on the radio, silence gave way to recognition. "Good shot, Blue 3. When they landed, the squad didn't party, but it didn't make a joke either. The man who had taught the aces to fly farther now proved that even without rank, he had the courage to kill and to die. The slaughter was symbolic. It was the final seal of acceptance. The engineer was now a warrior. The instructor was now a combatant. A civilian without an insignia had joined the American air elite not by policy, but by merit. And deep down, that was the essence of American superiority in that theater. To reward the result, not the title. While the Luftwaffe centralized decisions in technical committees, The U.S. allowed a civilian to redesign the war and confirm its theory in the line of fire. Lindbergh never showed pride in the slaughter. In his personal notes, he described the feeling as cold, necessary, and impersonal. And but for the men flying alongside him, that shot sealed something bigger than an aerial victory. It sealed the truth that, in a war driven by production and numbers, there was still room for a solitary idea, as long as it worked. And the idea worked. So much so that weeks later she would cross the Pacific, and it would reach Europe. Because while the P-38 flew farther into the Pacific, another American plane faced its own technical limit against German steel, the P-51 Mustang. And someone in silence was already testing whether Lindbergh's technique would work there too. On August 28, 1944, during an escort mission over the Vogelkop Islands in western New Guinea, Lindbergh encountered for the first and last the limit of his luck. His P-38 was surprised by a Japanese A-6M0 that emerged at high speed from a low cloud layer, opening fire at less than 300 meters. The gust passed inches from the cockpit, hitting the end of the left wing. Lindbergh maneuvered with surgical precision, using wide and controlled turns without accelerating sharply, just as he taught. He escaped, but barely. Upon landing, the fuselage displayed 3 clean perforations. There was no celebration. There was silence. And that silence echoed as far away as Brisbane, where 5th Air Force Headquarters reviewed field reports. General George Kenney, commander of the region, had already been closely following Lindbergh's activities. He admired his results but feared the consequences. The truth was simple and brutal. If Charles Lindbergh died in combat, the political tragedy in the United States would be immediate. A national hero, aviation icon, and controversial figure in ideological disputes, his death as a civilian in a war zone would be fuel for isolationists, critics of the high command, and opponents of Roosevelt. The political machine could not take that risk. Therefore, the order was issued clearly. Lindbergh should be removed from combat missions immediately. The data did not matter. Never mind the extended range of the P-38s. Never mind that his techniques had redesigned a significant part of the air war in the Pacific. The weight of politics was greater. The message arrived by encrypted radio to the command of the 475th. MacDonald read it in silence. Then he summoned Lindbergh for a private conversation. There was no discussion, just a firm greeting, a short thank you, and a silence that said more than any order. Lindbergh did not protest. He knew that his presence there had always been an exception, almost an administrative error, turned into a technical miracle. The next day, he left Hollandia on a C-47 freighter, carrying only his flight clipboard, a logbook, and the certainty that he had done more for the war effort than many cabinet generals. No driver made a speech, but everyone knew. From that moment on, his techniques would be taught by others, multiplied without his name, and yet they would come from him. In Germany, meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's intelligence analysis of the P-38's performance still classified them as limited in range and reliability, an assessment based on data from 1943. The gap was such that, in that same month, the Germans calculated that the maximum operating radius of American fighters was 700 miles. They were wrong by more than 250. If this kind of miscalculation still impresses you, comment here. Shocking data. Because in war, as in science, relying on old data is like flying with an empty tank. And in Lindbergh's case, even outside the front, his influence would continue, not by orders but by result. Because the true American doctrine was not written in the manuals, it was in the hands of those who dared to test. And one of them was now preparing to apply these same principles in the most iconic fighter of the war, the P-51 Mustang. Between September and November 1944, the skies of the Pacific went from being a range challenge to becoming a strategic depth domain. The cruising technique taught by Lindbergh, now widespread across multiple units, was beginning to alter the 5th Air Force's own operational planning. With the P-38s routinely operating on 900 to 1,000-mile missions, coverage for the B-25 and B-24 bombers extended beyond what maps had predicted. Routes previously abandoned due to excessive risk, due to the absence of an escort, have become viable again. And more than that, the formations could now react to weather diversions and enemy movements without exceeding the fuel limit. This tactical flexibility was responsible for saving dozens of crews who, weeks earlier, would have been forced to divert alone through hostile archipelagos. A campaign logistical report on Morotai indicated that between October and December, 76 missions were expanded in range, without the need for strategic replanning, thanks to the new cruise technique. The gains were invisible to civilian eyes, but devastating to the enemy. With a greater range of action, the P-38s began to operate as strategic interdiction fighters, destroying coastal convoys, newly opened airstrips, and Japanese fuel depots, even before they entered full operation. It was the doctrine of anticipation, now fed by technical autonomy. This changed the timing of ground offensives. With greater air cover, the advance on Leyte and Mindoro could be accelerated by weeks. American engineers, aware of the new range, designed temporary runways in places previously considered unreachable, reducing the time between the seizure of territory and the start of air operations. The war became simultaneously more agile and deeper, and the Japanese began to feel this new pressure. Imperial Navy intelligence officers, while attempting to map American attack patterns, recorded in captured documents, enemy fighters now appear in regions outside their estimated logistical profile. Our security predictions are no longer reliable. It was the collapse of defensive mathematics, and when the math falls, morale follows. But the impact was not limited to the Pacific. The lessons learned began to cross oceans. In November, engineers at North American Aviation tested pressure and consumption curves on the P-51 Mustang based on observations gathered from Lindbergh's flights. The first simulations showed something unsettling. The most versatile fighter of the war, already known for its extended autonomy, could still fly further. With the technique applied, missions over Germany, previously restricted to the outskirts of Berlin, could now include targets in Bohemia, southern Poland, and even around Vienna. If this type of technical expansion without structural changes surprises you, think about the following fact. In 1944, the U.S. produced per month more than 7,000 aeronautical engines. Germany, less than 1/200. It wasn't just a difference in quantity. It was the difference between operating at the limit and operate with margin to innovate. If this number impresses you, comment here. Absolute power, because the victory came not only from the factories, but from the way Americans used every screw, every liter of fuel, every idea. And the greatest irony of the war was about to unfold. While the Axis underestimated the industrial effort of the Allies, a select group of American engineers and pilots prepared one of the greatest demonstrations of technical supremacy ever seen, a mission of such improbable scope that it would force the Germans to revise all their calculations. Too late. By the end of 1944, Japanese intelligence reports began to show a pattern of confusion. Bases previously considered out of range of U.S. fighters, such as refueling facilities in Palawan, depots in Sulawesi, and command centers in the interior of Mindanao, were being hit with precision by squadrons operating without any additional support. The perplexity was evident in the documents. A captured report from the Japanese 2nd Air Division stated, "The enemy's fighters overshoot the anticipated limits without visible logistical support. The pattern of consumption cannot be explained by previous data." Japanese doctrine, founded on individual courage, suicidal action, and blind obedience, was not equipped to process this kind of innovation. Silent, technical, almost invisible, the knee-jerk reaction was to attribute the attacks to new aircraft models or to the use of unknown forward bases. The truth, however, was simpler and more humiliating. The Americans were using the same planes. Nothing had changed in the hangars. What had changed was the way they operated. And that was the essence of the chasm between the two sides. While Japan sacrificed pilots in kamikaze attacks to compensate for its strategic limitations, the United States refined its procedures to multiply range, impact, and efficiency. The Japanese mentality predicted heroism. The American company predicted sustainability. The difference between these two visions translated into numbers and lives. With each extended mission without losses, the American fighters reasserted their superiority not only in the air, but in operational logic. This confused the Japanese high command, who expected the enemy's war effort to be diluted by distance and attrition. On the contrary, what was seen was an increasingly precise, more coordinated, more effective effort. The diaries of captured officers on Leyte and Luzon reveal growing frustration. There is nowhere to hide. The enemy knows where we are, arrives ahead of schedule, and returns as if he had fuel to spare. The breach of predictability nullified the defenses. Japanese bases, designed to withstand attacks based on autonomy calculations, were now vulnerable to incursions that exceeded all estimates. Japanese doctrine, unable to comprehend the change, became a prisoner of its own rigidity. By ignoring the possibility of innovation in the use of the same machine, they lost control over the battlefield. And the cruelest, without understanding why. In a post-war interview with historian Saburo Yanaga, a former Imperial Aviation Logistics officer acknowledged, "We thought they had created a new type of plane. We never imagined that they were just driving differently." This confession is not just a technical recognition, it is a strategic epitaph, because there, in the space between an ignored technique and an immutable doctrine, Japan began to lose the war before it even lost its islands. And as the Japanese confusion grew, the Allies prepared the boldest application of efficiency doctrine, a mission into the heart of enemy industry, where even German generals believed they were out of reach of American fighters. It wasn't just the fuel consumption that changed with Lindbergh's arrival, it was the very feeling of flying. Up until that point, each mission was a calculation of anguish. How much flight time was left? How far was it to the nearest base? How much risk one could take before having to turn back? The cockpit of a P-38 was a place of precision, but also of silent fear. The limited autonomy of the fighters imposed a type of tension that was not measured in statistics. It was the invisible weight of uncertainty. But when the riders began to apply the settings taught by Lindbergh, reduced RPM, controlled pressure, calibrated mixing, something began to change within them. The reading of the pressure gauges was no longer a sentence. It became an opportunity. Flying is no longer a race against time and has become an extension of strategy. And this change, although imperceptible on the map, altered morale. Now a pilot knew he could extend his stay in the combat area by precious minutes, enough time to protect a damaged bomber, complete an attack, or simply not abandon a colleague. Trust has become a multiplying factor, an invisible but real fuel. There were reports of pilots who, after landing, found that they had returned with 20% more fuel than they anticipated, even in combat, and this margin gave room for something else. Courage. Not impulsive courage, but reasoned courage. The one that is based on knowledge, not bravado. It was the opposite of Japanese doctrine. While Japan asked its men to sacrifice, the U.S. offered them data, and let that data protect them. American superiority was not just in the factories, but in the cockpit, and each driver who assimilated that knowledge became a multiplier of the advantage. Decades later, in interviews with veterans of the 475th Fighter Group, many still remembered the exact settings they used after flights with Lindbergh. 300 inches, 2,000 revolutions, poor cruising mix, said one of them. It was not just a technique, it was an inheritance. A pilot, knowing that he could rely on his engine for longer, began to make different decisions. He started hunting more calmly, eager with more calculation, protect with more presence. It saved lives, and no statistics recorded this. But men remember, because trust is a silent weapon, and in war, silent weapons change destinies. The irony of this story is that the solution was before them all along. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts forgotten by most books, like and subscribe. This helps us to continue bringing to light stories that do not fit in the headlines, but define the backstage of victories. And speaking of backstage, there is another consequence of this transformation that few have noticed. Because as pilots change the way they fly, war planners in Washington, London, and Pearl Harbor began to revise their own maps. And soon, a mission would be authorized, one that would cross more than half of the planet, and that he would use Lindbergh's technique to prove the unthinkable. By the end of October 1944, the island of Leyte in the Philippines had become the new nerve center of the American Pacific Offensive. It was the beginning of a campaign that promised to be long, costly, and logistically unstable, at least according to the maps. The distance between the operational bases and the strategic targets of the Philippine archipelago put the American fighters back on the edge, or so it was thought. With the P-38 Lightning now operating with the configurations taught by Lindbergh, that limit simply evaporated. Missions that previously required carrier support or multiple intermediate stops are now executed directly from runways in Palau, Biak, and Morotai. The time between planning and executing a mission has been reduced by up to 30%. The front line advanced not by infantry, but by the autonomy of the engines. For the first time in the war, planners no longer had to ask, where do fighters get to go? But, where do fighters get to influence the war? The difference was subtle and definitive. With the new capability, medium bombers were able to attack Japanese ammunition depots north of Luzon with full escort cover. Troops that previously had to wait days for air cover now have real-time support. The battalion's advance toward Manila, expected to take at least 60 days, has been reduced to 38. In an internal report of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one official noted, "Logistics has ceased to be the anchor. It became the sail." It was no longer the limitation that dictated the pace of the war, but the ability to operate with technical margin. And this margin came from a civilian with a pencil and notebook. The most ironic thing was that, on paper, nothing had changed. The P-38s remained the same. No structural updates had been made. The manuals still advised against operating with low rotation and high collector pressure. But the reality in the theater of operations was different. The pilots had already internalized the new doctrine. On the radios, in the impromptu briefings, in the pencil notes on the side of the cockpit, Lindbergh's numbers spread like a secret language among those who flew. And as this doctrine took root, the impact was felt at higher and higher levels of the chain of command. General Kenny, in reviewing the performance of air units in advancing to the Philippines, wrote in private correspondence, "We are reaping the fruits of a change of mind. Efficiency, once seen as a detail, now dictates the geometry of war." Geometry in this case was the projection of power, and it expanded with each mission without losses, with each landing with fuel to spare, with each pilot who returned with more than hope, because now they came back with results. It was no longer necessary to conquer an island to secure a new foothold. It was enough to fly intelligently, and with that, the speed of the campaign became a destabilizing factor for Japan. Newly prepared bases were attacked, even before they were supplied. Arsenals hidden between mountains considered unreachable were hit with precision by fighters that, according to Japanese data, could never be there. It was a war of maps against reality, and the maps were wrong. If Japan still believed that its doctrine of resistance and sacrifice would succeed in slowing down the American machine, the facts showed otherwise. It was being overtaken by an equation, and soon, a new variable would enter the battlefield. Because if a civilian had extended the range of action of the fighters, what would happen when this doctrine reached the skies of Europe? In 1953, Charles Lindbergh quietly appeared on the cover of Life magazine. He was no longer the young hero of the crossing of the Atlantic, or the enigmatic civilian of the Pacific. He was an aged, reserved man, and now, finally, respected. The war had ended nearly a decade ago, but the debate over Lindbergh's role was still raging in political and military circles. He had been accused of sympathy for the enemy, removed from official offices, ignored in ceremonies. But among those who had flown with him, his reputation never needed restoration. It has always been intact. His campaign diaries were published that same year, revealing with technical precision and emotional restraint the observations he made in the field. Unlike the grandiose reports of generals or the fiery speeches of congressmen, Lindbergh accurately narrated the behavior of the Allison engine, the performance of the P-38 under different altitudes, the mixing efficiency in tropical conditions. It was the testimony of an engineer, not a politician, and there, between the lines, was his redemption. In 1954, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal by the Department of Defense, a protocol honor, but one loaded with meaning. Those who had previously considered his presence a political risk now admitted it. He had contributed decisively to the war effort, but for the 475th pilots it was nothing new. At a unit meeting in 1961, one of the veterans stated, "He didn't need a uniform. He knew more about our engines than any engineering major." This was Lindbergh's paradox, a man who failed publicly, but quietly won where it mattered most, in practice. His legacy was not forged on the podiums, but in the aluminum cabins trembling at 20,000 feet. It was not built with speeches, but with technical notes, practical tests, and cold decisions under enemy fire. Time has tried to reposition it, not as an absolute hero, nor as a villain, but as what he was, a brilliant technician, a meticulous pilot, an American who, despite his dubious political convictions, served more effectively than many acclaimed strategists. And this distinction is important, because in war, merit is not born from ideological alignment, but from the delivery of results. Lindbergh did not change the war with votes, but with data. And perhaps at this point lies the greatest lesson. In 1974, already retired and living in Maui, Lindbergh gave one of his last interviews. When asked what impressed him most about the war, he replied coldly, "How much we still waste, how much more we could have done, just in less haste." It was not remorse. It was analysis. The same one that had made him see what no one else saw. A civilian, rejected by the high command, expelled from the corridors of power, but who went down in history for making planes fly farther, and men come back alive. And while most of the tributes focused on his solitary crossing of the Atlantic, few knew that his true longest distance traveled. It was inside a jungle in the Pacific, next to the Satan's angels, and there, without a uniform, without a post, without a salary, he would change the story of a fighter jet. But the story of the fighter is still far from over, because as Lindbergh left the Pacific, a new plane was preparing to enter the scene. A slender single engine, with extended autonomy and absurd performance. A plane that would be the terror of the Luftwaffe. And in it, the ghost of Lindbergh's ideas would also fly. The Pacific War was not won by numbers alone. It was won by decisions, by voices that dared to question manuals, and by minds that understood that sometimes the problem is not in the equipment, but in the way it is used. What Charles Lindbergh taught with his cruising setup wasn't just a technique. It was a silent break with dogma. While Axis engineers stuck to perfect schemes, tested in wind tunnels and approved by layers of command, the Americans discovered that real warfare happens in the field, and that the playbook can be an anchor, not a compass. Lindbergh's knowledge was not new. It was available, but he did what few dare to do in times of rigidity. He tested, compared, measured, and applied. American superiority, so often attributed to the Detroit factories or the Pennsylvania Steel, was also born in the intervals between flights, in the improvised drawings with charcoal on the tarpaulins of the tents, in the nightly conversations between pilots and civilians. The Axis built doctrine. The United States has built adaptation. The Germans relied on norms. Americans trusted the data, even if it came from a discredited civilian. This philosophical difference created an invisible gap, because war, deep down, is a dispute between ideas, and a flexible idea, when proven in the field, is worth more than an entire fleet stuck in error. The Luftwaffe, for example, believed that its fighters should rise fast, strike hard, and return soon. All its air doctrine was based on short missions, almost always within German territory. When P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers to Berlin and back, the doctrine fell to the ground. They didn't know that behind that expanded reach was the same logic that Lindbergh taught in the Pacific. Pressure, mixture, RPM, cool head, the same war, two theaters, a concept, and most remarkably, without changing the engine, without a single structural modification, only with applied intelligence. I'd pause for the data. It is estimated that thanks to the adoption of the fuel-saving technique in long-range flights, more than 1,500 U.S. aircraft avoided crashes due to dry failure between July 1944 and April 1945 alone. Thousands of lives saved. For an idea. That's the ultimate irony. The Germans believed they would win by accuracy, for absolute control, for technical superiority, but they were defeated by something simpler and more powerful: the willingness to listen to the field, to change fast, of thinking outside the doctrine. And at the heart of this philosophy was Lindbergh, not as an infallible hero, but as a symbol of a type of power that is not printed in propaganda pamphlets, the power of methodical doubt, of technical courage, from the silence that asks, "Are we doing it the right way?" The victory, after all, was not in the engine. It was in my head. And who understands this? It's always flying farther, because the war ends on the maps. But it starts in the mind. And there is still one last lesson, one that can only be understood by looking at what the manuals never recorded. The collapse of Nazi Germany did not just begin with tanks burned or factories bombed. It began the moment his technical doctrine found something he could not measure: adaptability. While Berlin invested in jet planes that still had no range, in secret weapons that depended on miracles, and in leaders who ignored the battlefield, America adjusted throttles. He refined the logic. What defeated the Luftwaffe was not just the Mustang, the Thunderbolt, or the B-17. It was the idea that even a discredited civilian could see what the manuals didn't. Charles Lindbergh did not fly against Japan. He flew against the inertia of war. And he won. Because in the end, the real American weapon was not aluminum, nor oil. It was the humility to listen to data, and the courage to apply ideas. That's the lesson that echoes beyond the jungles of New Guinea or the runways in the Philippines. Logistics determines the strategy. Efficiency conquers empty heroism. And above all, modern warfare no longer belongs to the brave, but to those who think. Years later, General Alfred Jodl in Nuremberg would murmur when confronted with the numbers, "We were not defeated by soldiers, we were defeated by production." If you value this research and the search for truths hidden in history, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Comment below, what was the most shocking fact of this story? And don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.